Hello, Mark. Welcome to the Ann Phelim Scoop podcast.
Great. It seems like years since I've seen you guys.
I suppose what most people really want to know about the trial and all that is, how are your cats? How did they miss you? Because our cats, we were there for the month as well, and our cats were left us a number of angry messages when we got home. Let's just say.
I have to say, my cats were not in the least bit sympathetic about my defeat at trial in Washington, D.C. And when I got back to my cats, you'd almost think they didn't care a whit about the fact that I'd just lost in that hideous D.C. courtroom. Will you welcome my longtime colleague? He's got his own show in Canada. He's a best-selling author in Canada, but I always think of him as the plaintiff in the fabulous landmark lawsuit, Lawton versus Canada. And he's just one man, and Canada is supposedly a G7 nation, but he managed, to kick Canada's butt clear across the courtroom in that lawsuit. Will you please welcome Andrew Lawton? And will you also welcome my two, I fly flags of convenience. I'm one of Andrew's fellow Canadians, and I'm also one of these next two guests' fellow Irishmen. And that used to be a kind of good thing, but Ireland, even by the standards of Western nations, has absolutely gone down the toilet in the last few years. In a quite disgraceful way, but these guys did the best coverage of my trial in Washington, no question. And they hired an actor to play me, an Australian guy, who, among his other credits, is the voice of the Geico gecko. And I am thinking of paying off that $1 million judgment I got against me by actually seeing if I could get hired to be the voice of the Geico gecko. Will you please welcome Ann McElhenney and Phelim McAleer? We're going to talk about the media today, in part because the media are hugely influential in framing the narrative. And that's particularly true, I think, in America, which has a much more homogeneous media than most other countries. But we essentially inhabit different worlds, I think. And I always used to think that the difference was that on the right side, the right is more familiar with the left's world than the left is with the right's world. When I first came to America, the left basically never was acquainted with any of the right's way of looking at things, except one thing. That's when you took your car to be repaired. So the lefty guy takes his car to be repaired, takes it into the shop, and the first thing the guys do when they're working on the car in the shop is they tune away from NPR and put it on Rush's show. So the poor lefty goes and picks up his car a week later or whatever, drives it out of the shop, and this thing comes on, and for the 27 seconds, when he's frozen in horror, he hears Rush beginning his monologue, and then he's frantically jabbing the button to try and get back to NPR or whatever it is. And that was the brief acquaintance, I think, that the left ever had with the way the right thinks. And now I'm not so sure you even have that. We basically live in hermetically sealed media worlds. Is that right, Andrew? Is that how you see it?
It is, and one of the issues that I've always lamented, and this is particularly true in Canada, but I think it applies in the United States as well, is that your pipeline for journalists is a handful of liberal arts schools in big cities like Toronto, Vancouver. And it's urban children that are going to those schools, graduating, and they take the first available media job, which is, the CBC bureau in Saskatoon. And they have no interest in Saskatchewan or Saskatoon or Western Canada. It's the first job, and they're looking for the first the first way out back to Toronto or New York or something. And the problem is you have in the media climate this tremendous mismatch between the audience and the people that are supposed to be reflecting that audience, but increasingly are preaching to it. And that's why now you have journalists very unabashedly saying, we have a trust problem. And the trust problem is not them, it's you. You're you're problematic for not trusting them. And, I was in Davos recently reporting on it, and the theme this year was rebuilding trust. And it was amazing how, I know, they were good at the comedy, I'll say. It's the, Klaus Schwab at Yuck Yucks. But the thing that was fascinating about it is that nowhere in this analysis of the trust deficit or the trust crisis do they acknowledge that they have stopped long ago having any interest in holding the people they're supposed to serve in anything but contempt.
Yeah, I think what you said right at the beginning there, something that astonishes me, when you said that people go basically to one of 5 journalism schools. I absolutely can't understand why anyone would pay a high 6-figure sum to go to the Columbia School of Journalism to do a job that these days pays $23,000 a year. That makes absolutely no sense at all. The newspapers, over 80% of Americans never see a newspaper. And I'm not even talking about the print copy going down to your corner newsstand or whatever you used to do 25 years ago. Those brands are dead online, with the exception of the Daily Mail, which has become the most basically... Daily
The
Mail.
last newspaper subscriber is over there.
No. That's. I take it that's an American who's delighted to discover the Daily Mail website, which is where the only interesting news about the United States ever appears. It certainly doesn't appear in the New York Times or anything. But aside from the Daily Mail, the New York Times and all the rest of them have completely failed in transitioning to online. So online, nobody goes to the New York Times. Is that how you see it, Anne?
No, I appreciate whoever gave the applause there for the Daily Mail, because I certainly go there first thing in the morning. As you say, it's the only place that's reporting. But I have to say one thing good about the New York Times. They have a great food section. And the best part of the food section, I just think I might as well throw this in right now, because, everyone wants to bash the New York Times, and I'm right there with you. But they have a recipe section, and the best part of the recipe section, this is a massive segue, but sure, here we are,
We're going to do 40 minutes on this, so
on this
settle back.
On this section, what they have, the best part is they'll have a recipe, but then they have comments. And the comments go something like this. Trust me, there was a fantastic recipe, you can look it up, for chocolate lava cake for 2, which is cooked and served in a ramekin. And the comments were to this effect: I'm 38. I believe owning a ramekin is illegal for anyone under 35. I'm 85. I didn't know what a ramekin was until I came to this site. I'm 48. I now realize that a ramekin is what the cats are drinking their water out of. And on and on and on. And then somebody will say, I wouldn't have used that much bourbon or whatever. And the other person goes, nobody asked for your recipe. I can tell you it is magnificent.
This is their next reenactment that they're doing.
Yeah, no, this is... Look, can we just get something out of the way? What is a ramekin?
You've let yourself down very badly now, Mark.
No.
Everyone here knows what a ramekin is, right? Women, yeah. It's a beautiful...
Oh, no, we've got a ramekin crowd in today. How did that...
There's my people there, right there. So yeah, ramekin, really, really lovely. We have actually ramekins in our house in several sizes.
And we don't feed the cats out of them.
No, we're going to talk about the cats
actually,
later, by the way.
I think that actually, to bring it back to Mark's point, Anne.
No. Don't go there.
I think it's so easy. I think it's so easy to bash the New York Times. I just think that's so easy. But
how
many of you knew about the whole food situation?
I still don't know what a I still don't know what a ramekin is. Ramekin is not the same as Ramadan, is it? They're different, are they?
So now I'm discovering something about Mark after all these years. So he's not very familiar with the kitchen then, is that correct? A ramekin is how would we describe it? A small, often pottery created item that can go into an oven and can deal with an awful lot of heavy heat and then ends up being this delightful thing that serves one person, basically. And it's a delightful cookery utensil.
Okay.
I just don't know why the New York Times is recommending ramekins because they're all white.
No, but they're... But can I get back to what Mark was saying? Listen to what Ann said. The most interesting part of the New York Times is the comments section.
Yeah.
Right? Because as Mark often makes the point, it's American journalism is the most boring journalism on the planet. If you grew up in the British journalism world,
yep,
your eyes just glaze over when you read American, with the real story buried in paragraph 32. And that's what the Daily Mail does, by the way. The Daily Mail reads the New York Times and finds the story on page 32.
And puts it as the first
paragraph. Puts it in the headline and then just...
Yeah.
That allows me to quickly segue into something else. Can I do that? So I was a high school teacher, and I had these dreams of becoming a journalist. And anyway, look, I met a guy. Anyway, moved to Romania. It's a long story. We can talk about it up in the crow's nest at some point. And Phelim, at one point I decided I wanted to be a journalist. And it's a great story, by the way. This is going to sound bad. It is a great story, but there was a guy who was murdered in Dublin. His body ended up in a suitcase in the Grand Canal. Anyway, that story fell into my lap with my first story. Great story. Not for the guy, obviously. Yeah. But I remember Phelim, basically, I said to Phelim, I really want to be a journalist. And Phelim said, right, well, I'm going to help you, but, you're going to have to do all the hard work yourself. And the thing that Phelim always used to say, because I would be writing and I'd be going, the sun broke through, and then I was walking and I was thinking about things, mostly ramekins. And then Phelim would say, he would come, and I would have written very beautiful paragraphs, as you can imagine. And Phelim would come along and say, where's the story? He'd always say, where's the story? And my most beautiful paragraph, by the way, like beautiful, he'd go, okay, that's going. Where's the story? Where's the story? Where's the story? And it's exactly what I think of. Every time I read the New York Times, I think, where's the story? And then eventually, at the very bottom, you'll think, oh my God!
Yeah.
Look at this thing. Look at this amazing
There's
piece
an
of
interesting nugget in paragraph 73. And that's the one that the Daily Mail guys think, oh, wow, that's Hunter Biden did that. And then they do a full page on the thing that the New York Times buried in paragraph 73. What is odd to me is that the legacy media is clearly dead and dying. And it's not... it's still out there, but it's not going to be out there for much longer. The New York Times and the Washington Post can't actually afford to keep doing what they do. But we still have that stupid model, which I think is, as Phelim was saying, is unique to America, where every little small-town local newspaper, every little radio outlet, the television network news, they all take their cue from the agenda set by the New York Times, even though nobody is reading the New York Times anymore. So, and it seems to me that they're not so much aggressively liberal or left-wing. It's that they, as a conscious choice, to come back to that burying the story in paragraph 73 thing, their whole purpose is to keep their readership in the dark about anything interesting that's going on, so that people, there's whole stories that people, whole worlds that people don't know about because they get their news from the New York Times or CBS or ABC or whoever. Yeah.
Well, I have a great example of that, and I can do it, and it's even more than the New York Times. I've got a great example of this. This is going to be a great experiment now. Have you heard of Harvey Weinstein? Yes. Right. How many people think he should be in prison?
say.
Okay, all the people with their hands up, you are wrong. And the reason that but you're not dishonest. You just don't know. And the reason you don't know is it was never reported on, except for by...
Yeah, no.
And you can get that podcast for free. We'll indicate where to go to it. We went to that court case every day, and I can tell you what was amazing to me and super depressing was it was packed, the courtroom, with journalists from all over the world. It packed. We had to get up at 4 o'clock in the morning and stand in the cold. Anyway,
Yeah.
all of that, right? So, but we went in, and the prosecution would, ask all these questions of these women, and oh my God, and I cried, and he did this, and he did that, and all kinds of salacious, pornographic material. Fabulous listening, by the way. But then the defense would stand up, and they would ask something, and you go, oh my God. And the thing that I noticed, and it was almost a parody, all of the journalists stopped typing.
Yeah.
They were all going like feverish. They literally put the pens down. They stopped writing. And what the prosecution were bringing up were the most extraordinary pieces of information that are really newsworthy. And I'll give you one that'll just finish this point. Excuse me?
The prosecution, the defense.
The prosecution were the ones that the prosecution were who they covered. They didn't cover the defense. But here's what the defense brought out. Here's the question. If you were raped, do you think you would write to your rapist afterwards and say, I'd love you to meet my mother?
Yeah.
Do you think you would write to your rapist hundreds of emails saying, you mean more to me than my father? Can we meet? Would you write, I'll just do one more and then I'm stopping. Would you write to your rapist the day after you were raped and say, I'd love to go to London?
Yeah.
Can you pay for me to go to London? And go to London. And when you're in London, get in touch with your rapist and say, oh my God, I just heard that you're coming to London. I want to change my flight, so I'm here when you're in London. That put him in prison for 23 years. Okay.
Yeah. There's a Harvey, just to be clear here, Harvey Weinstein is a disgusting individual and a totally repulsive creature. And a man with very strange personal habits, particularly if you happen to like potted plants and things. And you certainly should not let your daughters anywhere near the guy. But the fact of the matter is that that trial was a travesty. And that guy, it's almost as, what's so weird about, because that's not even a particularly political thing, except that they decided that it was time to let Harvey go. And again, it's fascinating to me because he was like big buddies with Hillary Clinton and all the rest of it. But there comes a time, it's almost as if they just, okay, it's time to sacrifice Harvey now. And everyone agrees on these things, and there is no way back. You can't.
Well, I mean, funny, although I said buried in paragraph 72, it's now moved on, I think, to not covering the important bits. I think we're in the end phase now. It used to be, when we first came to America, they would possibly bury the story in paragraph 32. Now they don't cover it. Now, I mean, no journalist covered your trial.
Well, no, they waited until the right side won, and then they said, oh, this is a tremendous victory for people who are opposed to attacks on scientists. It was astonishing to me. The New York Times ran these stories after the verdict, never having sent a guy to the trial at all.
Yes.
And because you were there every day, you saw how the trial went. They basically, the whole thing was, oh, tremendous victory for science. This shows people you can't just attack scientists. Those stories could have been written 6 months before the trial, and the guy could have retired to the Bahamas.
That's correct.
And still
and
that story.
I met a couple of journalists. The Washington Post guy came on day 12, sat at the back, and I kind of naughtily started up a conversation with him. And I said, oh, we're doing this podcast. And I sent him the link. You know, back in the old days of Fleet Street, he would have stolen everything we had said.
Yes.
And packaged it and taken. We even gave them the transcripts, in the sense the transcripts that were there reenacted the most dramatic parts. So we'd basically written the story for them. An old Fleet Street hack would have went to the pub, got drunk, and stolen our stories. And passed it all and just put it.
No, that's right. That's right.
But they're not even. They won't even steal. That's how awful they are.
No. I mean, it is amazing to me how unreadable those newspapers are. The lefty guys, when I was starting, the lefty papers, like you mentioned Fleet Street Phelim, but The Guardian and those kind of papers were well written. So you wanted to see what the lefty guys' take on things was. And we used to, when I've been involved in the startup of 2 national newspapers in different countries, the Independent in the UK and the National Post in Canada. And in both cases, the National Post was a right-wing newspaper, but we wanted to have like a left-wing columnist who would drive people nuts, because the idea was actually to show the other side's thought processes. And there's none of that now, because nobody, on the one hand, you have people here, like you were doing your Klaus Schwab at Davos shtick just a moment ago, Andrew. Klaus Schwab is a big thing on the right because he says these absolutely, I always describing him as the sinister Teutonic megalomaniac hiding in plain sight as a sinister Teutonic megalomaniac, because he's there on video saying, the age of private car ownership is over. So, for example, they have all these traffic problems in Los Angeles. Well, you are not going to have that in the future. You will not be sitting in traffic on the freeway anymore, because all the freeways are going to be grassed over and turned into public parks. And there's government ministers, the most powerful businessman on the planet, all sitting next to Klaus Schwab as he says this, and they're all nodding their heads. And so there's one side that is thinking, holy, is it a conspiracy theory if the guy is actually saying it on camera every bloody day of the week? And then there's other people who somehow think this is still 1973 and everything's just cruising on as it always did, Andrew.
Yes, I mean, the old line is that yesterday's conspiracy theory is today's headline, but even now you can't say that because no one's writing the headline about the thing that's happening. And, to Ann's point about the dearth of journalism, can you think of a time more critical to have that than in the last 3-4 years? The answer is no. And just to give a Canadian example, if I may, Carleton University, which in some respects is last chance university in Canada, but has a relatively reputable journalism program insofar as journalism programs are concerned. They used to have 2 programs there, a science journalism program and a business journalism program, which were actually quite useful because those are areas where you want someone who's genuinely trained in it. Well, they replaced the science journalism program with climate change journalism, which is oddly not scientific, and they replaced the business program with diversity and equity journalism. So you look at that as being, I think, where the issues are coming from, because a lot of people used to view media bias as being a product of individual reporters' biases, but there are actually structural and systemic biases that mean you can't even get a story covered. I mean, I would take a biased report on something because at least they're reporting on it, but they're ignoring where the real story is. And one crucial example of this that's been going on for years, but especially since October, is Israel. There have been journalists that have said, an open letter from journalists, thousands of them across the world signed this, saying that objectivity is colonial. That objectivity is actually white supremacist. So you can't be objective because that means you're just feeding into the big Zionist Nazi state, which somehow exists in their view. So this is what we're up against. And it's never going to go away if people still think that, oh, well, as long as you can have, you know, the token conservative columnist on the editorial board, it doesn't work like that.
Is that... Because Phelim, you've been on the receiving end of 8 centuries of brutal, oppressive, torturing English colonialism, and he quite enjoys it. Is objectivity colonial?
No, I mean, that was the whole thing. I think that's why I got into journalism, because of these 8 centuries of oppression. And I realized growing up in Northern Ireland, truth was very important. I mean, you don't have any freedom unless you've got truth. You know, to me, that was why I got into journalism, was to tell the truth. It's much more fun, by the way. You know, it's someone
easy
once
to
asked.
keep your story straight as well if you tell the truth.
It's also, you know, someone asked me what kind of journalist I am. Eventually, I couldn't work it out, but eventually I decided I was a muckraking, troublemaking journalist, you know, and it's the only kind of journalist to be. And the only way you cause trouble is to tell the truth. You know, speaking loudly about something everyone else agrees with, all your friends agrees with, is not controversial. You know, people, I think that's the new definition of controversial in liberal circles, is I said what everyone else, all my friends are thinking really loudly and really forthrightly, and it's like, that's the least controversial thing, you know? Yeah.
No, that's what was fascinating, really, about the 2020 election, because the Hunter Biden laptop, had that come up in a Fleet Street context, people would have liked it regardless of the politics, because it was full of drugs and hookers and all that. I mean, Hunter is in some way a very touching person, because he uses his prostitutes as his confessors. So on that laptop, there's tons of stuff where he's just had sex with the prostitute, and then he's lying there relaxing with his crack pipe and everything, and he goes, you know, my dad's thinking of running for president. What do you make of that? And the hooker goes, who's your dad again? Oh, this isn't a 20, this is a 10. You still owe me. And that actually, it shouldn't be a partisan thing to be interested. You know, in the 90s, a lot of the British press was very conservative, but the Tory party had a habit of getting into sex scandals all the time, and it was always interesting things, like the guy who he expired on his kitchen table, dressed in nothing but ladies' stockings, with a satsuma in his mouth and a tab of ecstasy, and this was autoerotic asphyxiation, which most people had never heard of, but, you know, all the sophisticates say, oh yeah, everybody does that. And they all come. There was a guy who was discovered after the Conservative government launched its morality campaign, Back to Basics. There was a guy who was discovered to have been sharing a bed with another man in a French hotel. And his explanation was that it was because the second room was very expensive, and so they just slept back to back. So the Sun sent a couple of reporters to the hotel. They booked that room, they photographed the bed, and they put it on the front page under the headline, Back to Basics. And this was...
It's the good old days of journalism.
Yeah, and the Secretary of State for Wales, who went looking for a bit of rough trade on Clapham Common, and he got beaten up by the guy took the money and then didn't have any sex with him. Instead, he just beat him up. And the Secretary of State of Wales quoted the lyrics of the great song from La Cage aux Folles, I am what I am. And it was nothing to do with politics, because this is gold dropping off the trees into your lap, and to have no interest in covering. I mean, this is what is so weird now. These people are so anesthetized that it's the son of the Democrat candidate who's got all these drugs and hookup. Well, we can't possibly cover. I mean, that's basically the total destruction of any journalistic instinct.
It's the lack of curiosity, or pretended lack of curiosity. They have no interest in finding a story. The story has to be written a certain way. It has to be framed a certain way, and you don't look over there. You got to look here, because over there is much. By the way, Stephen Millington, I think was that guy's name. Yeah. He was the guy with the
Satsuma. Yeah.
He was a former journalist. That was back in the good old days when journalists were journalists. He was a former journalist turned MP turned.
A really good example, just of what you're saying, of kind of don't look over there, look over here, is after October 7th. We were in Ireland, and I have this group of ladies. We're in our 60s and 70s, and they're magnificent women. And almost my favorite one of them. And she said, "Oh my God, do you know what they've done? They've turned off the electricity in Gaza." She didn't even say in Gaza. I mean, I knew exactly what she was talking about. They've turned off the electricity. They, as in those awful Israelis. I said to her, that's what you're going with. But that's what she knew on October 8th. That's what she knew. She knew this awful thing about these awful people who had turned off the electricity in Gaza. That's what she went with, because that's what she'd heard about. I mean, if that's not the most perfect example, when the day before there was plenty to look at and talk about and report on in detail, but already they had moved on in Ireland. The media had moved on. This is all. She has no contacts in Israel. So she's dependent. She and other people, good people in Ireland, are dependent on the media telling them what's important, what needs to be known. And what needed to be known on October the 8th was that the electricity had been turned off in Gaza.
Yeah.
And I wonder if the electricity had even been turned off in Gaza.
Yeah, no, and that's true. The framing of an issue is more and more brazen. I remember, thinking things were odd. What is this now? 30 years ago, Waco in Texas. And I remember the nice a nice little old lady at my town library. She said, "Oh, I was listening to NPR this morning, and it's terrible. All those children in there were being abused." And I said, because I hadn't sort of assimilated to NPR norms yet, I said, "Yeah, so the solution is for the government to go in and kill all the kids." And her jaw dropped, and she goes, "Well, I hadn't looked at it that way before." And there's a lot of, I hadn't looked at it that way before in American media. Do you think, Andrew?
Yeah, I think Western media in general. And, one thing I'll point out, and just to go back to the Hunter Biden situation for a moment, because we've talked about, all three of us, what we've done in our own way, Ann Phelim and I, to circumvent this stranglehold on media, and that's by leveraging new media, podcasts, the internet. But you also have, every now and then, the rare person, whether it's the journalist at the Daily Mail or at the New York Post, that wants to tell the story honestly. And then look at what happened to the New York Post when they told that story. Yeah. Then all of a sudden, the big tech oligopoly comes down and says, well, we can't have any of that. And I think that's the problem here, because there is still a large subset of the population, and it's not just age, that is exactly like the Irish swimmer Ann just described, where they still rely on legacy media. And if it doesn't happen there, it didn't happen at all. And I've had this where I've broken a story that I have worked for weeks and months on, and I've published screenshots, I've linked to the reports, I do it all. And I'll talk to someone and they'll be like, "Well, but CBC doesn't have it, I don't know."
No.
And now the funny that CBC will have it in 3 or 4 weeks. They'll reduce it down to an essence that is unrecognizable. But that's the problem, is that as much as there is a distrust in the media, there's an abusive relationship that people have with the legacy media, where they don't trust it, they know it's not right, but it's still to them the authority. And if it's not on the newspaper, it's not on the TV news, it's still there. And that's a very difficult thing to break through, because without that, you're never going to have the people that are willing to look at an issue another way. It's the official media and then the fake news media.
Right.
The good point that they make about that I think is a great point, is where, if you're an expert on something, whatever it is that you're an expert on, that or your local area, or whatever expertise you have, and you go to the New York Times or any of the legacy media, and you read a story about the thing that you really know about, and you think, well, this is bullshit. Everything they're wrong about that. That's completely wrong about all the details about the thing that you really know about. And then, unfortunately, most people just turn the page over and they'll believe the thing on the next page. And it's like, hang on now, you've just discovered something here. You've discovered that this newspaper is reporting things that you actually are an expert on, and you know they're wrong, but you're going to trust them on the other thing. And people do that. There's a name for it. I can't think, but there's a clever name for it. Cognitive dissonance.
Yes. On that note, apologies to the non-Americans, but any firearms owners in here? You'll appreciate this one. So I read a crime story in my local paper a few years ago where they were reporting a terrible event. Police had seized a bolt-action semi-automatic handgun.
I love those.
Yeah.
If you're holding up the liquor store, you can't beat that one.
Yeah. And so it's bolt-action and semi-automatic cannot coexist. They're two separate things. But you know what? Some journalist reports it. And then you see which other journalists are copying the first one to write about it, because then they copy the same thing. But that's exactly it. So if you know firearms, you read that and you're like, well, that's clearly nonsense. They don't know about it. But then, but I'm sure they really know what they're talking about in the climate change story. I'm sure that this was just an outlier.
Yeah, no, and they're actually all full of things like that. What is amazing to me, though, is the way they can. What changed, I think, it's one thing to have implicit, to have a subtle bias, even if you're not covering certain stories, you don't. But then when a story comes up and it's out there, like this was a new development with the Hunter Biden, where they say, okay, this story's out there, Hunter Biden. Well, okay, we've taken the decision that we're not going to cover Hunter Biden. Well, why aren't you covering it? Well, because it's Russian disinformation. What do you mean it's Russian disinformation? Well, we've got a letter here from 57 heads of 57 intelligence agencies saying it's Russian disinformation. That was, and it was consequential, that decision, but the way everybody went to, the Facebook and the New York Times have told me that I shouldn't even let myself become aware of this story because 57 members of the intelligence community have said that it would be wrong for me to become acquainted with the story. That's a level of self-moralization that is actually entirely new, isn't it, Phelim?
Yeah, well, they used to talk about the October surprise. Yeah. That this was every election you've got to be careful. The October surprise could flip it, and there was an October surprise, but it wasn't. You weren't allowed to be surprised by it. This is the new. It's a whole new journalism world, and it's very easy to reminisce about the good old days, Fleet Street and that. I mean, Irish journalism now. Yeah. Which followed the British model of knocking strips of each other and sometimes literally. I mean, I used to go to award ceremonies where journalists would punch each other senseless over politics, because there would be the Conservatives there and the Liberals there and the Republicans there and
the good old days.
And they would knock lights out of it. I mean, they had to abandon the Northern Ireland award ceremonies. Because they always ended up there was years where no journalists won awards in Northern Ireland and the Republic because they ended up punching the lights out of each other. But they don't now. The only thing they do is they all land on John McGurk's gript. They all want to punch it. But all the journalists agree with everything now.
I know that's really pathetic because the idea of because like Northern Ireland awards ceremony, that was like a contradiction in terms back in those days. I mean, because you were right, there were all these people. They actually took it to they were prepared to get physical over their beliefs, and now whether they're unionist or a Republican or a nationalist or loyalist, Protestant or Catholic. They're all just a big bunch of pussies, basically, aren't they? And they don't. And it's incredible. It's the anesthetization of the press is one of the most disturbing trends, and actually a kind of totalitarian trend in a way. Well, we're going to switch it up now. We're going to start by, Phelim was talking about the good old days at a Belfast Awards ceremony. He's going to reenact that by punching Andrew's lights out and then dragging him off stage. We're going to switch it up now. And Ann and Phelim are going to interview me, and we're going. Unfortunately, Andrew, you didn't get the part. So, but good luck. Keep trying, and we'll see you at the next audition. Thank you.
Hello, Mark. Welcome to the Ann Phelim Scoop podcast.
Great. It seems like years since I've seen you guys.
Well, so I suppose what most people really want to know about the trial and all that is, how are your cats? How did they miss you? Because our cats, we were there for the month as well, and our cats were left us a number of angry messages when we got home. Let's just
Yes. I have to say, my cats were not in the least bit sympathetic about my defeat at trial in Washington, D.C. And when I got back to my cats, you'd almost think they didn't care a whit about the fact that I'd just lost in that hideous D.C. courtroom. Cats are funny like that. I think the dog detected I was a little lower than I was previously, but the cats just didn't want to know.
So, I suppose let's talk about the case. Well, I suppose people want to know what next. What next?
Well, what next is the appeal, and what I love about no disrespect to any Americans here, but there are aspects of the system here that I find very disturbing. As you know, I came out on the light end, just $1 million judgment against me, compared to Rudy Giuliani, which is 148 million, or President Trump, which is, I think, basically 2/5 of $1 billion now. And in order to appeal, you have to put up a bond for the entire amount of the judgment. So that Trump has to put up a plus interest for all the time it's going to be chunking through. The interest for Trump is 87 grand a day. That's the interest on the judgment against him. And I find that I wasn't actually aware of that until I think 2 days before the verdict in my case. But I find it all the places we're going to on this cruise, the Bahamas, Jamaica, the Cayman Islands, and it's actually in their constitutions that you have an automatic right of appeal to the highest court, which in the case of these islands, what they call His Majesty in Council, which is the Privy Council in London. You guys, well, you checked out of that. Anne checked out of that deal a few decades back, but the Cayman Islands, Jamaica, and the Bahamas are all still in there. It's an automatic constitutional right to appeal your case to the highest court in the British Commonwealth without having to put up a bond for 2/5 of $1 billion. There's things you learn if you have the misfortune to be, and by the way, this applies to Americans or foreigners. I gave this advice to Conrad Black 15 years ago, and then I neglected to take it. The minute he got into trouble and the Department of Justice targeted him and decided to take him to court in Chicago. I said, climb into the back of my pickup. I will throw a tarp over you. I will drive you out of New Hampshire, across the Quebec border. We will drive to Newfoundland. We will take the ferry to Saint-Pierre-et-Miquelon, which is the last remaining bit of French North America. And I will put you on the Air France flight from there to Paris. And you can find yourself some exile in a country without an extradition treaty with the United States. And I recommend that to anyone here, doesn't matter whether you're American or anything else, because, and I neglected to take my own advice, because the minute you're in the system, it's just, the judgment is the least, I mean, the judgment at the moment, I think, is about a sixth of the legal, because it was a 12-year case, and it came out at about $500,000 in legal expenses every year, and you can never get that back. So you can't actually win. There's no, you can't say, "Oh, I won the case," because you're still out $6 million or whatever. It doesn't. There has to be. Newt Gingrich was very kind, and he sort of signed on to this, but Newt is calling for serious judicial reform. It's not just about, oh, we'll get a Republican president and he'll appoint a Republican attorney general and then everything just goes on. No, this whole dirty, stinking, rotten, corrupt system needs top-to-tail reform.
I was watching Fox News last night. Mark Levin, who I'm not a fan, but he was talking about the Trump case, and he was talking about he was quoting is it the 12th Amendment, or whatever one part.
I think it's the 37th Amendment.
Of the Constitution, whatever part of it is, where basically, and he was using it in relation to what happened with Trump, but it was. There you go, 14th due process. And he was doing it in the case of Trump. No injury, no injury, no damages, whatever, and exactly the same as Mark's case. Exactly the same. Michael Mann's life has stratospherically improved. If anything, he owes you money. I mean, his life just took off in a way once Mark spoke about him. Like, he really became a superstar, started his bromance with Leonardo, made more money, won more prizes, got to do more speeches in every possible way, and then obviously found a sugar daddy, which we're all looking for in this life. Found himself a sugar daddy who has paid those bills for the last 12 years. And I wish there was a way that we could know who that is, by the way. But
yes.
I don't think there's any shortage of people who would have trumped up for him and given, and handed over the money. But it's chilling. I thought there was a chilling effect being there in the court. I mean, all the time that we were there, and we would say it every night, when we were recording the podcast, we would say basically, well, it's a DC jury. Obviously this was great today, with all this extraordinary evidence, but it's a DC jury. And then you see, it's the DC jury, and justice was not done, and there's something really chilling about that. And I've had too many experiences of this now. In the Weinstein case, equally, where he shouldn't be in prison. He really shouldn't be in prison. He's a terrible person, but he shouldn't be in prison. But this is even, more clear cut. It was, your case was so well argued. In every possible way, you answered the charges, and it was like, as you said, no case to answer for. And yet that jury, they had their minds made up from the get-go.
Funny, one of the recurring themes of the podcast was, why are the jury turning up late so often?
Yes.
Right, we never really added two and two together, because coming from the British system, if you turn up late for the jury, they send the cops to your door. They send the Brit wanker cops to your door, and you're hauled in, and then if you're still late, they'll sequester you. Well, they'll fine you £5,000 just like that, and they'll put you in the cells overnight so that you do turn up on time. I mean, it's very strict. But these
I had never. I've been in court various places for one thing or another. I had never seen that. Not just you mentioned in the British system, not just in Canada, but in my county court in New Hampshire, I have never seen jurors just, the trial can't resume for an hour because the juror has shown up late. And this happened almost every day.
Every day.
In this DC, people would turn up late for no reason whatsoever. Oh, you know, I overslept, and then I missed the bus, and you know, and it's. And I don't know whether that's just because Washington, D.C. is a company town, and if you work for the government, nobody cares if you show up an hour and a quarter late.
Well, I thought it said they had their mind made up. They didn't care about the trial. Mm-hmm. The trial was just a formality. They had their mind made up before the trial was over. Mm-hmm. So I mean, if you were truly interested in a trial, as a juror, you'd be there first thing in the morning, wanting to hear the evidence, wanting to hear, oh, that was interesting yesterday. I wonder how they're going to respond to that. There was no curiosity, no interest, so they turned up when they wanted to turn up.
Yeah, no, but you're right to point out that if you did it in Belfast, the Brit wanker coppers are banging on your door 5 minutes later and dragging you off if you do that. It's very
and the judge had nothing to say about it. I mean, the judge, he kind of laughed it off. Tomorrow, can we maybe tomorrow?
Yeah.
Tomorrow, let's try and be in on time tomorrow morning. And I'm we're kind of a little obsessed about punctuality, but it was I think it set a tone in a way. And it also proved as well that the judge wasn't strong, because I think he definitely had the opportunity at the end to do a directed verdict, right? He could have immediately stepped in because of the madness of what they did. That Rand Simberg, the guy who had written the original article, was being, he had these punitive damages of $1,000, but $1 million against Mark, and it's like, what are we saying here? What are you saying here? What's the difference here?
Yeah, that was basically $1 million to me. I got punished by $1 million because of one question. The man's lawyer asked me, said, is it correct that you have been a guest host for Rush Limbaugh and Tucker Carlson? And I answered the question, yes, and ka-ching, 7-figure sum just for that. And you're right, the judge was weak. I've been up before so many American judges. That's why, no disrespect to the Supreme Court, but the idea, I said to Tucker once, and he thought it was a good line, so he repeated it. I said, a judge's republic is a contradiction in terms. So this excitement about, when you look at and by the way, this is a lesson for the right, because the right has let go. So we don't care if the New York City Ballet is left-wing, because they're just a bunch of fairies prancing around on their toes, so we'll let that go. Oh, we don't care if sitcoms are left-wing. We don't care if the mainline churches are left-wing, but we're prioritized on 5 judges of this 9-man court. And then when you look at the pool from which they draw these judges, I've had one really great jurist, which was the second time a Las Vegas billionaire sued me. Among other things, he sued me for choosing, after he'd lost the first case, he sued me again because I picked We Are the Champions as my song of the week. And he criticized me for quoting the ABBA song, "The winner takes it all, the loser standing small." He said I was defaming him by implying that he'd lost the case, which he had. And I said, I denied that "The Winner Takes It All" by ABBA was anything to do with him. And I said, if I were going to pick an ABBA song that was about him and his second lawsuit against me, I would have picked "Mamma Mia, Here He Goes Again," which is... And so this guy, so he then sued me for calling him a cockwomble, which is a word that doesn't exist in American English. It's basically a British term. And we got this excellent judge and asked him for a detailed ruling of all the 100 claims. And the 100th claim was the one where he sued me for calling him a cockwomble, which is British slang. And the judge works his way through all the 100 claims, and then he gets to number 100, and he goes, no, he is a cockwomble. And that guy, and I would love to have, I'd have taken that guy over Amy Coney Barrett for the Supreme Court any day.
No, it is a big, it is a big problem that Republicans seem to be relying on two judges getting out of the right side of the bed in Washington to save the republic. You know, because as you say, they seem to have given up everything. But don't worry, the Supreme Court. Well, you know, the Supreme Court. So the thing that people, just from my own personal example, our backyard, there are 10,000 people in tents and RVs and meth heads, and more than 10,000, I think it's 60,000 all over LA. And no one says this, but the reason they're there is because 8 years ago there was a court case where an appeal court judges said, oh, it's a constitutional right. You can't to sleep on the sidewalk, and you cannot take someone off the sidewalk unless you are able to provide them with a house. Yeah. Right? So it's now it is laughable, but that is what they decided, and it was the circuit court. So the next step was the Supreme Court. They refused to take the case. Yep. And by the way, tens of thousands of people have died as a result from living on the streets, and maybe 100,000 have died since then, and people's quality of lives and people have died through crime and all that. And the Supreme Court refused to take the case. So we're depending, and it's not even that, to get the case to be taken. Very often it goes to the liberal judges, right? And they say, we're not taking this case.
No.
This kind of brings up a question, because I know we're kind of coming to the end, and I wanted this is a big question I wanted to ask Mark, because you've sort of touched on it there. What happened, conservatives, that they have given up completely on culture? They talk about culture. You know, famously Andrew Breitbart said that politics was downstream of culture. And I think Andrew definitely knew what he was talking about. But a lot of conservatives are very, you know, the conservative movement spend an enormous amount of money. You know, there's all kinds of speech making going on, all kinds of conferences going on. But in terms of the arts, exactly, they've abandoned the opera, they've abandoned the ballet, they've abandoned theatre, movies, the TV. You know, we watched the other night, you know, we watched the Chicago Med. We love procedurals, or we used to. We watched Chicago Med the other night, and at the beginning of it, Phelim said, this is the last procedural of mine that hasn't been woke yet, and it's great. So I was thinking, oh dear, that's a bad start. So we started watching it, and it's a medical drama, and the next thing, this woman is wheeled in who's pregnant, knows the baby has died, and she's left from another state. They didn't even name the state, but, you know, evil state, conservative state. And, you know, long story short, her life, she's going to die. She's going to die because of those awful conservatives. And you can imagine how that all ends up, right? And all very, very emotional, very, very dramatic. 6 million people watched that. Yeah. When did this start? And why is it that conservatives don't take? I mean, it seems to be something amongst conservatives. I don't understand it.
Well, it didn't used to be that. If you go back 50 years, there was a lot of tension. There were two sides in Hollywood, and it was well known there were two sides in Hollywood. There was an Oscar ceremony. This was, I think, 1972, 1973. It was hugely watchable, unlike the Oscar ceremonies now. Because it began with the guy who won the Oscar for Best Documentary Short. And he came out and he said he wanted to thank the North Vietnamese for his award.
Nice.
And then Frank Sinatra, who was one of the hosts that year, came out and said the Academy wished to dissociate itself from the North Vietnamese groupie's previous remarks. And then Shirley MacLaine came out and said, well, I'm a friend of Frank and I'm a member of the Academy, but I wish to dissociate myself from Frank's remarks. And so the thing just went back and forth, all through, bubbling under, all, because there were two sides back then. And what has happened since then, and I think it's absolutely... We had somebody here talking about, one of the questioners the other day, talking about empathy and how the left appears to be the most empathetic and they care about you. And that's because they tell stories, which is how any society builds its myths. So if you let only one group tell the stories, then you're basically abandoning the most effective levers in society. And it's worse, particularly now, because for the first time, I think the first time in human history, we have corporate storytelling. You know, it's one thing to say, oh, I never really liked Dickens, or I never really liked Jane Austen, but that's, you know, Jane's writing what she wants to write, and Dickens is doing his thing, and that's just a single creative imagination. Now, as you know, we have basically Walt Disney controlling something like 57% of the storytelling for the planet. So we have corporate storytelling, which actually is, I mean, I can't stand, I think superhero movies are inherently destructive because we don't need superheroes, we need regular heroes. I always like those stories where there's some guy, he's just some schlub going about his business, and terrible things happen, and he is called upon to rise to the occasion. Now you have these stupid things, you know, like X-Men 37, Cardboard Man 43, Franchise Girl 74, and oh, look, this is great, it's fantastic, and the last 20 minutes is this CGI thing where they're tearing. I love the way, even my kids got sick of it by sort of X-Men 22, where we're watching it and we're taking the stupid story seriously. And then at the end of it, some guy flies back through, rips a hole in the space-time continuum and goes back to 1958 to ensure that the guy they're battling has never been born. You know, Hamlet wouldn't have had those kind of problems if Shakespeare had used that device. But the whole point about the X-Men is they're mutants. So society fears them because they're different. You know, and, okay, could you just hit me over the head a bit more crudely so I get the subtext here? And this is, there has all... Good storytelling is inherently conservative because it's about consequences.
And it's telling the truth.
Well, it's because, you know, a girl goes to a 19th century social novel. So a girl goes to a ball and she dances with the wrong man and her life changes. Or even, you know, Scott Fitzgerald, he's got a guy who bounces a check for like $28, and his life changes. There are consequences. Mm-hmm. And the whole liberal storytelling thing is, I woke up this morning, I've been a 6'1" bearded man all my life, but I've decided I'm going to become a lady. And
I'm going to be a girl now.
Yeah, and there are no, that's great, that's fantastic, you be you.
I'm going to give some good news, though. I've got some good news. Disney have taken a massive hit financially for this nonsense. I think they've lost $1 billion on the latest bunch of movies that they've made. Yeah. So, you know, because I think it's important to have some good news, and I think, you know, yesterday I think we had the conversation about Bud Light. This is good news, because ordinary people eventually have had enough. And I thought it was interesting yesterday, this thing about, you know, about sport, because when the sport thing happened with the transgenderism, I thought, this is where it ends. When mothers and fathers say, my lovely daughter who's brilliant at gymnastics hasn't got a hope anymore. I thought that would be the death knell. hasn't quite been just yet, but you know, there's still hope, right?
Well, there's always the Disney thing is fantastic because people just. What's interesting is that we are a creatively dead society. I mean, as I said, I loathe all these superhero things, but there's two kinds of superheroes. There's the ones who were invented in the 1930s. That's Batman and Superman. That's 90 years ago now. And then there's the second lot, which is Spider-Man and the Incredible Hulk and all these guys who were invented in the early 1960s. That's 60 years ago now. We're running on fumes. I mean, this is really, and all they can do is they say, oh, well, you know, we're taking the Incredible Hulk, but we're going to make him gay. You know.
Well, and I mean, China used to be the great thing that rescued the crap Disney movies because they would take, you know, in fact, and they would actually have a Chinese character in it to appeal to the dumb Chinese. But the Chinese very quickly recognized they actually have a word for the Chinese character in the American movies that's supposed to appeal to the Chinese. They call them the flower pot because they'd come in, they sit there and sort of like that, a token, and then leave the stage. And but no Western movie is doing well in China now. Disney used to be China would rescue, and when we stopped going, China would still be the thing. Now all the top 10 movies in China are Chinese.
Yeah, it's because the business model for Hollywood became that you made these big movies. Essentially, the important market for them was 17-year-old guys in these huge multiplexes in China. And that meant more than anything, you know, who's watching it in Idaho or whatever. And so Harvey Weinstein, his whole business model, as you know, was to, he'd be having dinner with an actress and she'd say, oh, you know, I'd really love to play a strong woman role. And he'd say, oh, I've got a great strong woman, I've got a script for a terrific feminist picture with a fabulous strong woman role up in my hotel room. Why don't you come up there and I'll show you my strong woman script? And that was his business model. And they just made the chick flicks for the Oscar bait. And the important thing was how many 17-year-old boys in the Chinese multiplexes were watching the movie. And what Chinese 17-year-old boys want to see is heterosexual men beating the crap out of other heterosexual men. So they don't want to go and see all this rubbish where suddenly the superhero is a Muslima transgender. That isn't their bag at all. And that's actually, so it looks as if, just as the Chinese saved the world from the climate crazies at Copenhagen a few years ago when America and Britain and Europe were all ready to drive Western economies off the cliff in pursuit of saving the planet, and the Chinese vetoed it. So it's going to be if anyone's around to save Hollywood, it's going to be these 17-year-old Chinese guys who don't want all their superheroes to be turned into unconvincing transgenders.
So there's the message for the morning. The Chinese are going to save us. We probably should take questions. Should we take a couple of questions?
Do you want to take a couple of questions? Yeah, let's take a couple of questions.
This is an example. When I walk into the North Vancouver Public Library and I look to my left, I see a book called The Murder of George Floyd.
No?
Anyone who has seen the documentary of George Floyd's death would probably be of the opinion that he was not murdered by Derek Chauvin, that he in fact died of a heart attack and a drug overdose. My question is, do you think Derek Chauvin is guilty of killing George Floyd, and does he deserve to spend the rest of his life in jail?
Well, the interesting question on that last point is how long the rest of his life is going to be, because he's already been badly beaten up in the, you know, I talk about the Department of Justice, dirty, stinking, rotten, corrupt U.S. Department of Justice, but it has many elements in it, including the Bureau of Prisons, which, as you know, let the most the most valuable prisoner in America die mysteriously, Jeffrey Epstein. They've let this guy, Derek Chauvin, be vicious, because he was, this is again, the whole system is, oh, you can't have double jeopardy, they say. Oh, well, you can if it's a so-called human rights case. So he was convicted at the state level and convicted at the federal level, and chose to go to prison, to the federal prison, where he was badly beaten up. Yeah, he did not, this goes back to getting Conrad Black under my tarp in the back of my pickup and driving him across the border. It's a corrupt system. You can't get a fair trial in it. Certainly he could not get a fair trial. Now, I don't particularly like American policing in many respects, but that guy is not the murderer of George Floyd. And it has no business. You know, the American racial paradigm is very particular. It has deep historical roots here. And the idea that George Floyd becomes the most important black man on the planet if you're in North Vancouver, if you're in Bristol, England, if you're in Brisbane, Queensland, the way the George Floydization of the entire world's racial relations was a disaster. But Derek Chauvin did not commit the crime of murder. He was subject to as I said yesterday, it's whom, just like Lenin said. It's, you know, the black saint and the brute white man. And once you know that, and it's similarly, you know, I don't want to compare myself, because fortunately I'm not being beaten up in federal prison, but in my case it was, again, the climate scientist who wants to save the planet and the climate denier. And once you know whom, you don't need verdicts.